Imagine this. It's 1910 and you're strolling through an international medical conference in Europe. The legacies of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch are being celebrated for discovering that tiny microbes, not bad air, cause diseases. Revolutionary, groundbreaking. The audience applauds these European geniuses who saved humanity. And then, from the back of the room, a Brazilian doctor stands up. "Excuse me, but while you are identifying bacteria in your fancy European labs, my colleagues and I have been eradicating yellow fever by hunting mosquitoes, discovering entirely new tropical diseases, and vaccinating entire cities. Also, a Cuban doctor named Finlay figured out mosquito transmission 20 years before Walter Reed's discovery, and you all laughed at him." Okay, this never happened. But it could have. The history of germ theory that we're usually taught is like a family photo with the European scientists front and center, while their Latin American colleagues are barely visible in the background. Today, we're adjusting the focus to reveal the full picture, and trust me, the overlooked parts are fascinating. Hello, lovely history fans. I'm Dr. Julia Martins, your resident historian and proud Brazilian. Now, I'm deeply interested in the history of medicine, and as in so many cases, the way we are told this story tends to focus heavily on Europe and the US. So, today we're exploring tropical petri dishes as we discover how Latin American scientists didn't just adopt germ theory, but revolutionize it. Yes, you can be a scientific hero while wearing flip-flops in a tropical lab. Who knew? If you're new here, bem-vindos! Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy learning about hidden histories, subscribe for more, and if you're feeling extra supportive, join me on Patreon. Because let's be honest, historical research doesn't fund itself. Now, when I discovered that history textbooks devote long chapters to Pasteur and Koch while relegating Carlos Chagas, who basically discovered an entire disease single-handedly, to a mere footnote, I knew we needed to set the record straight. So today, we're flipping the script on this scientific tale. Get ready for brilliant discoveries, daring self-experiments, and yes, even a vaccine riot. History is wild, folks. Let's start with a quick history refresher. Until the late 19th century, most doctors worldwide believed that many diseases came from miasma, poisonous vapors rising from swamps, sewage, and decomposing matter. Got cholera? Probably those bad smells from the river. Yellow fever must be those foul vapors from the pot. This miasma theory dominated medicine for a long time. Then, in the 1860s, Louis Pasteur in France demonstrated that microorganisms cause fermentation and putrefaction, not spontaneous generation. Shortly after, Robert Koch in Germany developed rigorous methods to isolate specific bacteria, identifying the causes of anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. Together, they established what we now call germ theory, the radical idea that invisible microorganisms, not bad air, cause specific diseases. European medical journals celebrated this paradigm shift as if science began and ended in Paris and Berlin. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn, because while Europeans were just beginning to grasp the basics of microbes, physicians in the tropics were already making remarkable leaps forward. In 1881, a Cuban physician named Carlos Finlay stood before the International Sanitary Conference in Washington, D.C., and declared that yellow fever, the disease terrorizing port cities across the Americas, was transmitted by mosquitoes. His evidence was meticulous, detailed correlations between mosquito prevalence and outbreaks, careful observations of disease patterns, and even mosquito breeding experiments. It was brilliant work. And you know what happened? He might as well have been talking to a brick wall. The scientific community collectively yawned, rolled their eyes, and moved on to the buffet table. One American delegate sneered that Finlay's theory was as plausible as the inoculation of yellow fever by mosquitoes hatched from the eggs of mosquitoes that bit patients with yellow fever. Plot twist, that's literally how vector-borne diseases work. The delegate thought he was being sarcastic, but he accidentally described the exact mechanism. It's like mocking someone's theory of gravity by saying, "Oh sure, next you'll tell me that objects are attracted to each other based on their mass." Well, yes, exactly. But Finlay wasn't alone in being ahead of his time. Even earlier, in 1854, Louis-Daniel Beaupertuis in Venezuela had proposed that mosquitoes transmitted yellow fever. He wrote to the French Academy of Sciences with his theory and was promptly ignored, because obviously a doctor in Venezuela couldn't possibly know more than European experts who had never even set foot in a yellow fever zone. The tragic irony? These insights could have saved thousands of lives decades earlier if they had been taken seriously. Instead, they collected dust until 1900, when US Army Dr. Walter Reed finally discovered what Finlay had been saying for 20 years. Reed at least credited Finlay, writing the theory of insect transmission was first suggested by Dr. Carlos Finlay of Havana. But history books still often present Reed as the hero of the story. This pattern, Latin American insight followed by North American or European validation and acclaim, would play out repeatedly in the germ theory saga. While Cuban and Venezuelan doctors were being ignored about mosquitoes, Brazil was building something remarkable, an entire scientific ecosystem dedicated to germ theory, almost from scratch. The catalyst? Bubonic plague, arriving in the port of Santos in 1899. I mean, nothing motivates public health investment like the Black Death making a surprise comeback tour. Medieval problems require modern solutions, am I right? So the Brazilian government, suddenly very interested in microscopic organisms, established the Federal Serum Therapy Institute on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. They appointed a young physician named Oswaldo Cruz, fresh from studying at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, as technical director. Cruz and his team began working in converted horse stables at an old farm called Manguinhos. Imagine trying to produce cutting-edge vaccines in what was essentially a fancy barn. The pressure was immense. They worked day and night with limited equipment, racing against the spread of plague, while the government demanded immediate results. And deliver he did. Within months, Cruz's team was producing effective anti-plague serum and vaccines. This was Brazil's scientific declaration of independence, no longer importing European remedies, but creating their own. Of course, Cruz wasn't working alone. In São Paulo, a Swiss-Brazilian physician named Adolfo Lutz was directing the Bacteriological Institute. Lutz was known as the most skilled microbist in Brazil, the guy who could spot a bacterium from across the room. Meanwhile, the Butantan Institute, led by a physician with the incredibly on-the-nose name of Vital Brasil, yes, that was his actual birth name. His parents really committed to the patriotic theme, I guess. Anyway, he specialized in producing antivenoms for snake bites. Together, these institutes formed a scientific triangle that would transform Brazilian medicine. But the real test would be applying this new knowledge in the real world. And that's where things got complicated. And by complicated, I mean there was literally a revolt. In 1903, Brazilian President Rodrigues Alves made a decision that would either be remembered as visionary or catastrophic. He appointed 30-year-old Oswaldo Cruz as Director General of Public Health for the entire country. Imagine putting a 30-year-old today in charge of national health policy. Twitter, or X, or however you want to call it, would implode. But Cruz was a prodigy, and Alves gave him extraordinary powers to transform Rio de Janeiro, then one of the unhealthiest capitals in the world. Cruz targeted 3 diseases with military precision: yellow fever, bubonic plague, and smallpox. His methods were, let's call them, assertive. For yellow fever, he deployed mosquito brigades to systematically destroy breeding sites throughout the city. For plague, he organized rat-catching campaigns, paying citizens by the rat. And for smallpox, he pushed through a mandatory vaccination program. Now, Cruz was fully aware of how extreme his methods were. His approach was uncompromising because he believed the public health crisis demanded nothing less than total commitment. Unsurprisingly, opposition was fierce. Political cartoonists had a field day depicting Cruz as a mad scientist wielding giant syringes like weapons. One newspaper called him a scientific dictator, treating citizens like laboratory rats. The 19th century anti-vaxxers were surprisingly creative with their rhetoric, perhaps the one area where they outperformed their modern counterparts. But I digress. Anyway, the situation exploded in November 1904 with the Vaccine Revolt, which was against mandatory vaccination. For a week, Rio de Janeiro descended into chaos. Mobs attacked sanitation workers, barricaded streets, and clashed with police. The government temporarily backed down. But here's the plot twist. Cruz ultimately won. By 1907, yellow fever was eliminated from Rio for the first time in memory. Smallpox and plague were controlled. The death rate plummeted. This was perhaps the world's first successful disease eradication campaign based on germ theory, predating similar efforts in Europe and North America. Cruz had proved that even a tropical nation could conquer epidemic disease through rigorous science. Similar transformations were happening across Latin America, with scientists willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prove their theories. In São Paulo, physician Emílio Ribas and Adolfo Lutz designed a bold experiment in 1903 to silence miasma theory advocates. They first exposed volunteers to contaminated materials from yellow fever patients, but protected from mosquitoes, and no one fell ill. Then, in the truly courageous part, they allowed themselves and other volunteers to be bitten by mosquitoes that had fed on yellow fever patients. When one volunteer contracted the disease and Ribas himself experienced mild symptoms, they proved that mosquitoes, and not bad air, transmitted yellow fever. This scientific bravery wasn't limited to Brazil. In Peru, medical student Daniel Alcides Carrion made the ultimate sacrifice in 1885. To prove that two mysterious illnesses, Oroya fever and Verruga peruana, were different stages of the same disease, Carrion inoculated himself with blood from a patient's lesion. He meticulously documented his symptoms as they developed until he tragically died from the infection, proving his hypothesis at the cost of his life. Today, the disease bears his name, Carrion's disease. The commitment of these Latin American scientists was extraordinary. They risked and sometimes lost their lives to advance medical knowledge, a level of dedication that's almost unthinkable to most of us. Can you imagine a modern epidemiologist writing in their grant application about injecting themselves with unknown pathogens? The ethics board would have a collective aneurysm, I guess. While urban centers were being transformed by militant mosquito hunters, a young Brazilian doctor named Carlos Chagas was about to make medical history in the most dramatic way possible. In 1907, Oswaldo Cruz sent Chagas to combat malaria among railroad workers in the remote interior of Minas Gerais state. Imagine being dropped into the Brazilian wilderness with a microscope and a medical bag and told, "Good luck with the malaria situation." That was basically Chagas' assignment. While treating patients, Chagas became curious about a large blood-sucking insect common in local huts, the kissing bug, or barbeiro, barber, so named because it often bit people's faces while they slept. Side note, is there anything more terrifying than an insect nicknamed for its habit of biting you while you're unconscious? Sweet dreams, everyone. Anyway, suspecting that these bugs might transmit disease, Chagas dissected some specimens and discovered an unknown parasite in their intestines. He sent samples back to Rio, where his colleagues confirmed that it was a new protozoan. They named it Trypanosoma cruzi in honor of Oswaldo Cruz. Chagas then examined locals with mysterious symptoms: swollen lymph nodes, irregular heartbeat, and enlarged thyroid glands. In 1909, he identified the same parasite in the bloodstream of a sick 2-year-old named Berenice. In one extraordinary scientific achievement, Chagas had discovered a completely new disease, now called Chagas disease, identified its pathogen, its insect vector, its animal reservoirs, and its clinical manifestations. This had never been done before by a single researcher, not by Pasteur, not by Koch, not by anyone, at least to my knowledge. In his 1909 report to the Brazil Medical Journal, Chagas wrote with justified pride, "We believe this to be the first time that a researcher has the opportunity to study, from the beginning, the entire life cycle of a human pathogenic trypanosoma, as well as to establish experimentally the role of an arthropod in its transmission." News of Chagas' discovery spread through the scientific world. In 1912, he received the prestigious Schouten Prize for the most important discovery in parasitology. He was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. But, and you knew there was going to be a but, despite being the only nominee in 1921, Chagas was not awarded the Nobel Prize. The committee chose to make no award that year rather than recognize the Brazilian scientist. It's like when a teacher says, I would rather give everyone a 0 than award points for this answer from this student I don't really like, except instead of a classroom assignment, it was one of the most important medical discoveries of the century. Talk about academic snobbery. And this wasn't just academically important, it revealed a hidden health crisis affecting millions of rural Latin Americans. Chagas disease still affects 6 to 7 million people today, particularly in poor rural areas. In later writings, Chagas reflected on how tropical medicine revealed social inequalities. The great diseases that devastate humanity are the sad privilege of poor populations. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and in our country, this trypanosomiasis, are the consequences of abandonment, of the absence of prophylactic defense. This social consciousness became a hallmark of Latin American public health, recognizing that controlling disease meant addressing poverty and inequality. While European bacteriologists were focused on microbes in petri dishes, Latin American scientists were confronting the social conditions that allowed those microbes to thrive. By the 1910s, Latin American scientists had completed a remarkable transformation, from students of European methods to innovative practitioners and teachers in their own right. The Oswaldo Cruz Institute in Rio became a powerhouse, training scientists from across Latin America and even attracting European researchers interested in tropical diseases. By 1910, Brazil was exporting vaccines and antisera, sending medical missions to neighboring countries, and gaining international recognition, finally. At the 1916 International Congress of Medicine in London, Brazilian tropical medicine was featured prominently. Latin American scientists had moved from being recipients of European knowledge to contributors to global scientific discourse. They published in international journals, presented at conferences, and established their own scientific traditions. So what made their contributions distinctive? 3 things. First, necessity drove innovation. When yellow fever is killing thousands in your city, you don't have the luxury of academic debates. You need solutions now. This pragmatism led to bold public health interventions and self-experiments that might have been considered too risky or unconventional. Second, Latin American scientists excelled at synthesizing laboratory science with field epidemiology. Oswaldo Cruz wasn't just a laboratory researcher, he was also a public health strategist who could implement his knowledge on a city-wide scale. This integration of research and application was sometimes more advanced than the specialized European approach. Third, tropical environments provided opportunities to study diseases that couldn't really be investigated in Europe. I mean, Carlos Chagas couldn't have discovered trypanosomiasis in Paris or Berlin. He needed to be in the Brazilian countryside, where the disease and its vectors existed. This environmental advantage allowed Latin American scientists to make unique contributions to tropical medicine. By the 1920s, the flow of scientific knowledge had become bidirectional. European and North American researchers were studying Latin American methods of disease control and vector management. The periphery had become, in some areas, closer to the center. The story of germ theory in Latin America forces us to redraw our mental maps of scientific progress. For too long, we have imagined science as radiating outward from Europe and the US to the rest of the world. But the reality was far messier and more interesting than that. Latin American scientists weren't passive recipients. They were active innovators who adapted and advanced germ theory in unique ways. Their contributions weren't peripheral. They were central to some of the most important developments in public health. The first successful disease eradication campaigns happened not in London or New York, but in Havana and Rio de Janeiro. The mosquito theory of yellow fever transmission was first proposed by doctors working in Cuba and Venezuela. So what prevented their full recognition? Partly, it was the scientific hierarchy, where discoveries made outside recognized centers faced extra scrutiny. Partly, it was language barriers. Publications in Portuguese or Spanish reached smaller audiences. But it was also tied to broader stereotypes about the tropics as places of disease rather than medical innovation. There's a lot of racism that is pretty hard to ignore here, too. This Eurocentric bias has consequences even today. When the Zika virus outbreak hit Brazil in 2015, it was Brazilian scientists at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation who first connected Zika infection during pregnancy to microcephaly in newborns, a crucial discovery that changed our understanding of the virus. Yet many international journals initially hesitated to publish their findings without validation from American or European labs, creating dangerous delays in the global response. So, the next time you hear about how germ theory changed the world, remember the microbe hunters of the tropics, who not only embraced this new science, but advanced it in crucial ways. I'll leave you with a question. What other areas of history might look different if we stopped seeing the world through such a Eurocentric lens? What other contributions have we overlooked? Because like those 19th century doctors who missed the mosquitoes for their miasma, we might be missing the most interesting parts of the story. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And do consider becoming a patron and supporting my work on Patreon. It truly helps. Muito obrigada e tchau, tchau!